Okay, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our panelists and to our YouTube viewers. Today's panel discussion is the fourth in our extremism series and will explore dimensions to online forms of extremism. Now, since the 90s, the digital revolution has transformed the interactions of people worldwide. Originally intended as democratic sites of cultural and information exchange, the borderless, largely anonymous, unregulated and mostly democratic nature of the internet and online platforms has meant that some individuals and groups have harnessed these online spaces to manipulate their original purposes, often spreading hateful and abusive rhetoric and ideology. Now, according to last year's statistics from the ONS, 65.6 million people in the UK access the internet daily. 53 million people were accessing social media daily. Now, included in those statistics were individuals who were using online spaces such as the dark web or for the purposes of recruiting terrorists, spreading misinformation across various platforms, and even distributing violent and viral video and live content. Now, academic literature has shown that the internet creates more opportunities to radicalize and become radicalized without physical contact. In policy, the UK government and bodies are concerned about the ways in which extremists are adapting some of their methods in line with new technological developments or new and emerging online spaces such as Twitch or Steam, to name a few that are popping up. Now, we'll discuss this question of whether effective methods of curbing or countering extremism online can be adopted by governments, individuals, or other regulating bodies. Before we begin, just a caveat to say that online extremism is a vast and a hugely complex and a far-reaching topic. Therefore, the research that is presented today and any examples that are given are by no means exhaustive, but they are demonstrative of just some of the problems that exist in the online space today. Now, we're fortunate today to have several experts working in the field of countering online extremism, both in the UK and internationally. We have Dr. Carmen Aguilera Carnarero, who is lecturer in the Department of English and German Philology at the University of Granada in Spain. Carmen is also a senior research fellow at CAR, that's the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right. Next, we have Liam Duffy, a recognised strategic advisor for the UK's counter-extremism project and a researcher on counter-terrorism. Liam has also presented on Prevent. And we're also very kindly joined today by Dr. Eviane Leidig, who is a research fellow in current and emerging threats at the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague in the Netherlands. And finally, myself, a research fellow and a project coordinator here at the Dialogue Society, and I will chair today's panel. So we'll hear from our panelists first before we move on to a short question and answer as ever at the end, where YouTube viewers, you can post your comments in the sidebar as we go along. Okay, so let's jump straight in and I'll hand over to Carmen first, who will be our first speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you. May I share my screen with the material? Yes, so that you can see, I guess. Can you see the presentation? My presentation? Yes, yes. Okay, let me see here. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, Nikoleta and Dialogue Society. And well, Nikoleta, when she invited me, she proposed to talk about certain topics and questions. She posed me 3 questions, so I decided to use those questions as landmarks and organize my talk around them. So the first question was, why does extremism emerge online? And that is a very interesting question, and I'm going to talk here about the topic from my perspective as a linguist. So the first thing I wanted to point it out is that the internet is considered by many as a self-regulated independent realm that is absolutely alien to the rules and the laws that regulate our daily life. And also that even though it's true that the online world is expected or is said to be the perfect communicative ecosystem for the spread of hate and extremism, hate and extremism is a social construct, so it's created and born out of a particular economic, political, and social cultural context. So it's independent of the media and the technology through which it spreads. So it's in that sense prior to social media, definitely. However, the online communicative ecosystem favors the dissemination of extreme behavior. In that sense, I would like to comment and to point out several of the features of online communication that has been pointed out by scholars such as Kosravinik and Esposito, whom I will base my presentation upon, especially when I talk about the democratic character, democratic features of online communication, the de-individuation, and the anonymity of it. But before that, I would like to point out something which is essential, a concept which gives cohesion to my research, which is the concept of digital dualism, and or has been called the fallacy of digital dualism. That states that actually digital dualism states that online and offline realms are totally separated and not connected at all. And against that, Jurgenson coined the idea of the fallacy of digital dualism. It's not that the online and the offline realm are not connected, they're intertwined and intermesh constantly. We have to, I think that all of us are aware of the constant connectivity and the always-on availability that provides the online communication. But talking about one of the main features of online communication is the democratization. So social media communication is immediate, is participatory, and is global. And there is an incessant production and sharing of information content. That means that the direction of communication has changed and is now bi-directional. And all of us are consumers. We are a mixture of producers and consumers of information. Talking about the individuation is another key point to understand the spread of extremism online. Why? Because in all the reports I have read about terrorists or extremist incels, from incels to white supremacists, all of them were described, and I quote that because this is the most recurrent phrase, they were described as isolated individuals. That is, they feel they need to belong and to create and to have a group identity. And how did they reach that group identity? How do they reach that sense of belonging? Well, by means of a common interest that extremists just throw to them. So it could be sports, could be pop culture, could be memes, as we will see later, could be dating, the online seduction, could be politics, could be video games, could be music sometimes. What is true is that this sense of de-individuation favors group salience and polarization. On the one hand, we have the lack of moderate or contradicting voices. On the other hand, we have the exacerbation of extreme and divergent opinions. In this sense, Professor Mira Idris pointed out, underlined the fact that during the COVID-19 outbreak, the amount of radicalization in US among teenagers and pre-teenagers and youngsters increased dramatically. Why? Why is that? Precisely because what I have just commented. Because imagine as we were all locked down in our houses, the amount of time spent in front of a computer, of a screen, the echo chambers created, the lack of an adult voice or contrasting or contradictory voice, not in the school, not outside. So that favored this kind of extremism and radicalization in a group of more vulnerable people, probably. In that sense, it's important to also remember the concept of virtual community, how people can bond from a transnational perspective because they share some common social values. And in that sense, also the concept of ambient affiliation. They do that, they commune over the internet, and they do it by the enaction of semiotic resources such as hashtags or memes, as I will comment later. This de-individuation, in this concept related to this concept of de-individuation, there is a prevalence of the acceptance of group norms over individual standards of behavior. And this loss of individuality is associated with a loss of personal responsibility. This promotes the formation of silent mobs, which is actually an escalating phenomenon because the spread of mob dynamics and mob mentality online. So mobs compete to spread hate and attack individuals online. So they do it in diverse ways, but I would like to point out two metaphors used by Aguilera because I think they are very visual. On the one hand, we find the swarm, that is that individuals react to different stimuli in unpredictable ways. And on the other hand is the metaphor of the army, which implies a much more carefully planned and designed recruitment, propaganda, and accomplishment. Both of them, and many more, they are not mutually exclusive. And actually, they are usually combined. Before continuing, I would like to point out a comment that drew my attention made by Boromisia Gashi, who actually stated that those who create and distribute hate speech rarely, or extremism or extreme ideas rarely describe it as such. So the category of hate speech or extremism actually is simply alien to them and their behavior. Another important point on why extremism, radicalization is easily spread online is the concept of anonymity or the so-called perceived anonymity, which gives users freedom to act. This lack of disinhibition and the lack of fear of losing face is connected with the Jaegis effect, using the name given by Claire Hardaker to this phenomenon, in which makes reference to the myth of Jaegis and his ring of invisibility. And this is because users perceive cyberspaces in a different way that they perceive interactions offline. And part of this perception is due to the physical separation. The lack of a face-to-face contact also leads to the different perception of each other's humanity. The lack of nonverbal cues, for instance, facial expressions, body language, suprasegmental features such as voice, tone, rhythm, intonation, makes it different to grasp, for instance, some nuances such as irony or sarcasm. That is, the salience and perception is solely and exclusively concentrated in the text, which leads to the usually distorted, usually frequently augmented perception and impact of online aggression. That is, social media affordances act as a force multiplier, both in terms of sheer quantity and vitriolic quality of interaction. This is a quote by Kosravinik and Esposito. I totally agree. So thus, is social media responsible? Is the one to blame for the creation of extremism and hate speech and this kind of extreme speech? No. But does it favor? Definitely yes. So another question that Nikoleta made to me last week was, how do extremists make use of various online platforms? What content do they post? Well, in my studies on the Islamic State and the far right, not so much, 3 are the main goals I found. One is, but there are many others, but the ones I got in my data mainly are propaganda, recruitment, and indoctrination. How do they do this? Well, they post content about, various topics: sports, pop culture, memes, dating, politics, video games, music. These are what they call weak ties, so that they can recruit and indoctrinate people for their different causes. Here, I'm going to show now part of my research, just very briefly, so that you can see something I will comment later. One of the typical products of this online communication are memes, is a collaborative product of this 2.0 online communication. And Schiffman defined memes as, in a way that I really particularly like, which is that they are tokens of postmodern culture. But here you can see through memes in my study of Islamophobic memes, in which I compiled 350 memes from the years 2017, 2021, you can see the same narrative that you can expect in other kind of different media, newspapers, television, another kind of media, you can find the same narratives through memes. So here you have the typical trope of Muslims are terrorists, or here you have Islam and Muslims are inherently violent, having or displaying an inherently violent behavior. Here you have another typical narrative line, which is Muslims are, Muslim men particularly are over-sexualized, is associated with them is zoophilia and pedophilia. And of course, you have women, and actually the largest subset of Islamophobic memes were gender, to the point that we decided to study them apart, and it's in the process of publication on that. So gender Islamophobic memes. Here you have the complete dehumanization of Muslim women, compare them visually with garbage bags, or being objects and totally oppressed. So in our studies, for instance, we can find that memes, which are typical of online communication, replicate the same narrative lines that you can find in other kind of media. You have here the three main groups of gender Islamophobic memes, where Muslim women are presented as oppressed, or they are presented as sexualized and as saleable bodies, and sometimes as terrorists. And some of the categories are overlap many of the times. What is important, however, and I would like to underline, is that memes in this case represent the trivialization of online hate. And is sometimes assumed, and this is the problem I see, as a normal feature of the internet. And I would like to emphasize that is frequent, that something is frequent doesn't make it normal, whatever normal is, but what under any reason is acceptable. That is, the fact that it's frequent doesn't make it acceptable and doesn't make it normal. In this case, in the case of memes, hate is masqueraded through parody. That makes that is difficult to detect for people who have not been trained in critical thinking. They cannot understand. They assume, they internalize, they assimilate that kind of discourse as something frequent, in the end, because of frequency, as something normal and as something acceptable. That is the problem. So don't forget that extremist ideologues frame, justify, and often lead their growing online army of haters and extremists in different ways. The use of memes is one of the most common ones. And the third question Nikoleta posed me is that what is about the internet and online platforms, including social media, that facilitates this? So that was before I knew that Eviane was going to be invited to the panel, so she is the expert on this. But I will just briefly say something that is actually deplatforming has pros and cons. It has proved to be insufficient to solve the problem, to fix the problem. It's true that some platforms are taking active measures, but it's true also, especially in my studies of Islamic State, that they have an amazing capacity of adaptability. So they migrate to other platforms, maybe more encrypted, blogs which are not regulated by content moderation, alternative social media sites. Even though content moderation has not proved to be the solution for that, it's true that they reduce their presence and influence online, that they have a smaller, lesser number of followers. It's true that they cannot, because of that, they cannot influence mainstream narratives and discussions in the same way that if they move to fringe platforms. Still, some problems is that some extremism on social media remains undetected, especially those who belong to private accounts or private groups. The false positives that you can find in negative and content moderation. And also something, well, gender I mentioned here, which is a factor that Eviane will talk later because she's an expert on that. Also, another problem is that when extremist groups migrate from the mainstream platforms to other fringe platforms, the levels of toxicity increase. And I would like to finish up my presentation with a question which is always there about censorship, free speech, and the debates and content moderation. And the issue of double standards is that some extremist groups accuse platforms of bias, being biased, before blocking or even sometimes before the blocking or takedowns happen, sometimes later, sometimes after the blocking happens. But if they frame themselves and their groups as victims, actually this has a consequence of deplatforming, because somehow they shield extremist ideas from the full force of content moderation. So somehow they influence these companies about acting on them and their ideology. And I think I made it on time, or I try, and thanks a lot.
Wow, thank you so much, Carmen, for that whistle-stop tour of various forms of extremist activity that we see emerging online, and also to run us through some of your ideas about how we can perhaps curb these activities. I think something that's really key that you brought to our attention were these social identity theories that play out on online platforms, lots of heterogeneous dynamics at play. You mentioned how weak offline ties, for example, lead to strong online ties through this virtual community forming. And I've seen that a lot in research, where Reddit subgroups, for example, are referenced for perhaps their enabling of far-right extremism. And I also really enjoyed your work on semiotics using memes, which highlights a broader point, I think, about how the high adaptability of these extremists in exploiting popular cultural trends as we go throughout time. So thank you so much for that. And we will return to some questions on your research area at the end, but for purposes of time constraints, I'm going to move on to Liam, so I'll hand over to him. Thank you.
Horace, thank you. I'm also going to share just a handful of slides, if that's all right. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can see that, and that's in full screen. Nikoleta, could you just give me a nod or a thumbs up or something? Awesome, thank you. Well, yeah, really tough act to follow. I found that a really interesting presentation. Might come back to some of the themes if I don't blabber over my time slot, which I usually do. So I'm not an academic by any means, by any stretch of the imagination, but I've been around quite a lot of the countering extremism or countering radicalization, preventing radicalization initiatives for a few years, not just in the UK, but in other countries in Europe, in North America, in the Middle East and East Africa as well. And I kind of chose this image to kick off my discussion, because if you search radicalization on a Google image search, you will get dozens and dozens of images like this. And it's just, whether they're related to like news coverage related to discussion of radicalization or opinion pieces, or they're images chosen for kind of counter-extremism initiatives or funding streams, this is the kind of image you'll get. And it's supposedly kind of representative of this idea of radicalization that became popular, particularly around 2014, 15, 16, with ISIS recruitment flows from Western countries to Syria and Iraq. And it kind of cast radicalization as this mainly online process, which kind of happens to isolated, usually vulnerable and adolescent teens in their bedrooms, kind of who are more or less bewitched by some kind of nefarious online recruiter in another country operating. I mean, even this view was even popularized by the then Commissioner for Counter-Extremism, who for the UK, who wrote a piece in the national press talking about how girls, after Shamima Begum left for Syria, talking about how girls are being kind of groomed in the same way that like street groomers operate in the real world, but an online version of that. Excuse me. The apex of that was these kind of headlines. I mean, I think CNN took this one down, but I've just chosen, or maybe being a bit unfair to CNN, but I chose this one as kind of the absolute, probably the worst example of this kind of recasting of radicalization, talking about luring recruits, in this case, luring women with kittens, Nutella and emojis. And there was just this general fascination that you know, terrorists were using the internet and were using social media. First of all, like, what, you know, they're human beings. All of us use social media every single day of like I mean, you know how you used to say BRB, like be right back, as in when you were logging off on MySpace. Like, there's the whole meme about how no one says that anymore because we're constantly online. So I don't think it should necessarily be a surprise that terrorists use the internet and use social media to communicate. But there was this whole idea of radicalization being recast as grooming, particularly that it happened online, particularly that it happened to young and vulnerable people. And in response to that, a large amount of funding was poured into online responses, and I kind of I sound hypocritical because I could probably be accused of being part of this industry, but an industry popped up around online radicalization with various organizations, you know, committing to countering extremism online, countering radicalization online. Governments poured funding in this more or less because they didn't really know what to do about thousands of their citizens joining what we all saw was a very horrifically violent terrorist group in the Middle East. The only problem with that, of course, is that it was almost completely inaccurate, to put it bluntly. I'm not sitting here to absolve social media or tech companies or anything like that. I think they're responsible for all sorts of social ills, and many of the things Dr. Carmen Aguilera pointed out definitely resonate with me as well. And my own organization, Counter-Terrorism Project, puts a lot of pressure on tech companies to take terrorist content offline, which still needs to happen, of course. However, I think that there's been, by making online responses kind of the cornerstone of our understanding of extremism, and therefore the response to it has been a mistake. And just to clarify, I am talking only about jihadist radicalization here. I think it would be a mistake to act like there's kind of a commonly understandable model or aggravating or underlying factor for different groups. I don't know the specifics because I'm not a specialist on them. I don't study them. So I'm just talking about jihadist radicalization at the moment, which is still a threat, even if it fades from our kind of attention. So I'm just going to move some boxes around so I can see this slide. So if it's not an online phenomenon, what is it? I think we tended to neglect jihadist radicalization as a territorial and geographical phenomenon. So if you look at over 6,000 on the conservative estimate, and over 6,000 Westerners from citizens of Western countries joined ISIS, over 90% came from just a handful of countries. So hopefully, I don't know what's going on with all my boxes on the screen. So hopefully you can see which ones I'm talking about. France, Belgium, UK, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands. And even back then, there was all sorts of talk about how Scandinavian countries were unaffected because they were supposedly more like egalitarian and things like that. But actually, Scandinavian countries per capita were worse affected than almost anyone, apart from the likes of Belgium. If you go on a country by country basis, you can go down even into cities, into locales, into neighborhoods, even actually into postcodes, and in some cases in Europe, apartment blocks, which are very, very heavily affected. And in some cases, places next door are almost completely unaffected. So a city like Birmingham, which was very affected by the foreign fighter phenomenon, majority of foreign fighters from Birmingham came from just 4 wards in the city. So wards being kind of like a postcode, I guess, if people aren't familiar with that. You see same patterns in Cardiff, Portsmouth, parts of London, which were really badly affected. Some cities of the same size, same conditions, were not affected at all. France, is a really interesting case study of this for a few different reasons, but one of the most interesting is the difference between a city like Toulouse and a city like Marseille. Relatively similar population. Marseille has all sorts of socioeconomic challenges, as I'm sure people know. Toulouse does too, but it's also a bit more of a middle class and affluent student city. Hundreds and hundreds of Toulousains ended up joining ISIS, whereas at most a handful of Marseillais, so people from Marseille, actually joined ISIS. So if the internet was the prevailing factor, or if socioeconomic conditions were the reason behind this, we wouldn't see that massive disparate impact in different places. We wouldn't see that huge geographical clustering. And we're not talking about widespread around Toulouse. We're talking about very specific areas of Toulouse as well. Same happened in Sweden, in Gothenburg, 150 foreign fighters from just one district, which has less than 500,000 people. So still a minority phenomenon. It's important to bear that in mind, but it's still very, very heavily geographically concentrated. Here again, moving my boxes around. Just to explain these two diagrams, hopefully illustrate my point a little bit more. One of them is an image I stole from the Belgian police, so hopefully there's no one from the Belgian police watching this presentation. But you can see the foreign fighter distribution in Belgium. Belgium was the worst affected Western country per capita by the foreign fighter phenomenon. And you can see the huge geographical clustering on that map. Obviously, you take into account population centers, but some areas with large populations, all the kind of prevailing socioeconomic challenges that you might come to associate with radicalization, completely unaffected, whereas some weren't. And I think Molenbeek became notorious around this time as being one of those specific locales that was heavily affected by this. On the other side, you can see the map from the Institut Montaigne think tank in France. You can see some areas really, really heavily affected, some areas not affected at all. The tiny little blip there being in the southeast being Marseille, compared to the big blip in the southwest being Toulouse. Trappes is an interesting case study as well, a commune about 25 miles from Paris. I think it set the national record for foreign fighters, whereas a commune right next door with almost exactly the same conditions on the ground was completely unaffected. Lunel, a middle class, affluent, small village, small town in the southwest, really badly affected. Neighboring towns not affected whatsoever. So it just shows you the territorial dimensions of this problem. So if it's not online and it's territorial, what's going on here? So to quote Jit Clausen, the curator of the Western Jihadism Project, the growth of terrorist jihadist extremism is best explained by a simple axiom: to become a terrorist, you have to know one. So real offline physical connections still matter for jihadist recruitment. They still matter. That's not to say that these people don't use the internet to communicate. WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, of course they do. They're human beings like you or I. We all use those apps as well. And then the same in the UK. We haven't had the same level of research in the UK, but that's research from the Tony Blair Institute. Rachel Bryson did a really good report. Sample of 100 British jihadists connected in some way to just 6 individuals. Some of those are household names, more or less: Abu Hamza, Anjem Chowdhury. So this list of jihadists is the kind of pre-ISIS, but the patterns still hold in the ISIS era. And this is research that was just published this week from GNet Research, Nafis Hamid and Christina Ariza. Our findings show the primary threat still comes from those who have been radicalized offline. They're in greater number, better at evading detection, more likely to complete a terrorist attack successfully, and more deadly when they do so. So if it's about relationships, if it's about networks, we can actually go even further into the key variables there. It's not just about that. The key variable, and we know this from research that's coming out of France and Belgium in particular, is on-the-ground activism and the presence of jihadi veterans, as you call them. So as much as we might think that the ISIS foreign fighter flow was like unprecedented, it wasn't. It was unprecedented in its scale, but it wasn't unprecedented in the phenomenon itself. So people have traveled from Europe since the 80s and 90s to jihadist conflict zones, from Bosnia, Algeria, Chechnya, Somalia, and in between conflicts, even people would travel to Salafi jihadist communes in the Middle East, like in Yemen and in the Horn of Africa. And just coming back to Toulouse, a really, really good example of the influence of on-the-ground activism and relentless recruitment is that of Fabien Klein, who went on to join ISIS along with dozens of people he knew from Toulouse. So he was influenced by Olivier Carrel, a Muslim Brotherhood dissident who became a Salafi jihadist who settled in the countryside around Toulouse. Fabien Klein and his brother were converts to Salafi jihadism. They started as a handful of people in the early 2000s. A few French citizens from Toulouse, they helped get to Iraq to fight the American occupation of Iraq, but they were still only a handful of people. But 10, 15 years of door-to-door, literally door-to-door recruitment, knocking on people's doors, and the network that they had in Toulouse a decade later was 300 to 400 people. And that is, from that network, Mohamed Marat emerged, who was allegedly a lone wolf, the guy who went around on his moped attacking soldiers and Jewish school children in Toulouse in 2012. So the impact of these physical on-the-ground networks should not be underestimated at all. And again, just to quote Hugo Micheron, who's done some really good work on this, French academic, the areas that have produced the vast majority of European fighters correspond to historical settlements of veterans of the Afghan, Algerian, and Bosnian jihads of the late 1980s or 1990s. And then along similar lines, scholars in France who probably would have a lot of disagreements with Micheron and with other scholars have all come to a very similar agreement. So Hakim El-Karoui and Benjamin Hodai said, don't think in terms of radicalization and brainwashing, but of recruitment, commitment, and activism in the real world. Even further than that, Bernard Rougier's work shows that actually where the jihadists were able to operate in Europe was terrain that had been kind of ideologically prepared by Islamist activism over the course of 30 or 40 years. So be very careful. I'm saying Islamist there, like as in political Islam, not just areas with high proportions of Muslims, which is, again, I talked about where the socio-economic explanations fall down. This is where the explanations, the elements of the right and the far right fall down as well. Like some of the memes were shown in the previous presentation. The idea that this is a Muslim problem or this affects Muslim populations falls down as well, because you have some areas with large Muslim populations which are completely unaffected, Marseille being a good example of that. So it's the key variables of these these in the real world activists. If I could just make one final point, I think hopefully I've gone in time. I've got no idea how long I've been speaking, but one final point. I think a few years ago, this was misled and mistaken to kind of overemphasize on this. I think actually the kind of industry that's popped up around this in some ways has become, where it was misled and mistaken a few years ago, I think it's actually become a much more dangerous and nefarious problem, where we're increasingly seeing the abuse of online extremism as a way of knocking people offline, as a way of political repression, and a way of censoring people for or on the grounds that they're mainstreaming online extremism or they're radicalizing people, and that seems to be being applied without much discipline and without much precision at all. And there was talk about bias in social media companies in the last presentation, and how extremists talk about bias, and I hope I can make this point without being accused of being one, but it's certainly not only extremists who talk about political bias. I think there's this idea that online radicalization, extremism, and misinformation and conspiracy theories is only going in one side of the political spectrum, and I don't think that's accurate. And I think the fact that it all flows in that way is reflective of a bias in this conversation. So I think we need to be very, very disciplined. There's some really, really good work going on to study online extremism, some important work to study actual online extremists, but we need to be very, very careful that this isn't used to kind of close off the increasingly digital public square from dissenting voices. That's it from me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liam. I think it's really important that you've challenged some of those narratives. I think it's one thing to deplatform and to restrict people's activity online. It's another to take away their freedoms and their human rights as well, their digital rights perhaps. But I think thank you for highlighting the offline dimension to online extremism. The two are not strictly mutually exclusive. They do, as you've made the point, one facilitates the other. Sometimes they work in tandem with each other. Sometimes the offline works first, the online second, or the other way around. And also you've drawn some nice parallels with Carmen in highlighting some of the use of memes in targeting certain groups that are used in jihadi recruitment. And this use of iconography is not a contemporary occurrence. It's something that has existed throughout history, and we've seen this in propaganda used by various far-right political parties and dictators in history. So thank you so much. We can return to that governance point at the end, but that ties in nicely with what Eviane will present on now. So I'll hand over to her, and thank you so much to everyone so far.
Great, thank you very much. Let me pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, please do let me know if there's any technical issues. So Yes, thanks very much for the invitation to contribute to today's panel. So for my talk, I'll be focusing specifically on gender, and in particular, the role of women within the far right, and how this ties into countering online extremism. So to start off, and to really summarize what has been discussed on the panel so far, we know that social media and alternative media have opened up new avenues for propaganda, recruitment, and radicalization, and perhaps most importantly, for forms of community building and bonding. Now, I want to focus on the role of far-right women today, in particular highlighting the rather insidious role that they do play within this space, because it's often seen to be non-political. And yet we know that far-right women have several key roles, and that is as recruiters, propagandists, organizers, and fundraisers. And I think this is also an important distinction based on perhaps the stereotype that we have about who is a stereotypical far-right user online, which is often this image of a man who's sort of accessing the dark web and fringe forums. But today, what we're seeing is that far-right women are taking to social media sites to recruit followers and build audiences for their movement, often preferring to spread their message on mainstream platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And I'll explain why they choose these platforms later on. So I wanted to start off by discussing an aspect of radicalization, which I call red pill vlogs in my work. So for those who are unfamiliar, the red pill is a euphemism that the far right uses in order to signal the first step of their radicalization journey or process. Now, the red pill concept comes from the 1999 film The Matrix, in which the protagonist Neo is offered to take the red pill and be awakened to the truths of society, or to take the blue pill and to continue living in a life of ignorance and delusion. And the concept of the red pill first emerged in the so-called manosphere to indicate those who held deeply anti-feminist worldviews, and it's since converged with the far right to coalesce around things like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which motivated the Christchurch shooter, and adjacent themes like white genocide. So these, what I like to call far-right female influencers, are quite frequently create videos on their YouTube channels. It's their first or second video on their YouTube channels in which they discuss their experiences of having been red pilled and that journey that they took. And what's quite striking amongst all of these red pill vlogs is that these influencers tend to share very similar backgrounds. So they, most of them grew up in middle class or even wealthy neighborhoods and families. They went to university, and they even ended up working in professional employment, climbing that corporate ladder, living in urban areas and socializing with friends and colleagues. And then there's usually a pivotal moment in their lives, which they describe as being deeply unhappy and depressed with their life situation. And they attribute feminism for this unhappiness, that feminism supposedly prohibits women from exercising what is their, quote, natural or biological duty, which is that of traditional gender norms. And media scholars describe this type of relationship that these influencers have to their viewers and subscribers as network intimacy techniques. And so these are techniques such as relatability, accessibility, authenticity, and responsiveness. It's the way of describing their own personal stories and narratives in ways that really connect with their fans and their followers. And what is actually a common follow-up video to the red pill videos is that these influencers will then discuss the consequent loss of social support, so really family and friends, which is a common theme that emerges. But they justify the loss of these social support networks as something that's seen to be worthy and courageous. Because in many ways, these women are simply trying to find their most authentic selves, their most confident selves. And this does, in a way, hide a rather hateful ideology by masking it through these narratives of authenticity, of finding self-confidence. Now, when it comes to recruitment specifically, these far-right female influencers do tailor their approaches towards women and to men quite differently, but there are some similar themes that emerge. So on the left-hand side are examples of posts that these influencers or types of content that they post in order to appeal particularly to women. So the post on the left is taken from Instagram, and it reads in the description, "Glow up. If it could happen to me, it can happen to anyone." And it shows 2 photos. Pick one: under eating, in a bad relationship for 7 years, heavy smoker, feeling numb inside, lost. Whereas pick 2 is eating healthy, married and pregnant, off all drugs, feeling joy and gratitude for my life, saved. And she writes further down in the description, "These pics were taken 4 years apart and it didn't happen overnight. You've got to put in the work for the reward. Be patient with yourself." Deprogramming, which is now the new type of word used instead of red pilling, is a long process. And here she's indicating the type of personal transformation and the fact that it did take years to achieve her best self. And interestingly, we don't see much research looking into the role of Instagram as a platform for radicalization and recruitment, but with these women, they are very good at using the affordances of Instagram in order to get across to their fans. And in particular, she uses the term glow up here, which is a term that's popular amongst the beauty blogging community to signify achieving your best natural self, your best healthy self. There is also a narrative that far-right female influencers use, which is centered around bonds of sisterhood. And essentially their message is to other young women that if you join us, you will find like-minded women like ourselves who believe in traditional values. And that's captured by a selfie there between 2 women, saying it's hard making female friends these days in a world of feminism and cattiness. And actually, based upon the comments that they received on this Instagram post, the 2 then decided to make a follow-up YouTube video while they were traveling together on the Defend Europe mission, emphasizing the same talking points about how feminism allegedly makes women competitive against each other and prohibits genuine friendships. And I've indicated here the type of cross-platform posting that happens. And I do want to emphasize that because it is important to recognize the much broader ecosystem in which content travels across different types of platforms. Now, when it comes towards recruitment efforts tailored towards men, the narrative that these influencers promote is one centered upon the fact that society allegedly prohibits men from exercising their quote natural biological masculinity, that is attributes like leadership and aggressiveness within the public domain. But by joining the far right, this provides a space for young men to exercise those masculine traits. And I will say that when I was doing research on this topic, I had expected most of these women to actually have mostly female followers, but I actually found that they had mostly male followers, at least on YouTube. Instagram is a different story. It tends to be more female followers, which is an interesting contrast. And actually based upon topics pulled by her Twitter followers, an influencer decided to make a YouTube video for her male followers on how to red pill women. So it's a guidance for how to red pill their wives, sisters, girlfriends, mothers, etc. And she emphasizes the importance of young women today in terms of being deeply unhappy with their life situation as a way of initiating that conversation. And then finally, there are also alternative media sites. I've listed one example here of Red Ice TV, which is a white nationalist site that's based in the US and Sweden. It's actually been banned on YouTube for promoting white nationalist views. But incidentally, one of the co-owners of Red Ice TV is a woman who, in a way, actually inspired what a young man who attempted an attack outside of a mosque in Oslo, Norway. And this young man had described watching lots of Red Ice TV content before carrying out the attack, and indeed becoming obsessed with the idea of finding a wife, having white children, and settling down in the Norwegian countryside. And this indicated to me the very insidious effects that far-right women could have in influencing young men in potential acts of violence. Now, in the remainder of my time, because I know it's short, I just wanted to focus in particular on aspects of platform governance and online regulation. So building upon Robert Gurrow's work, which is that platform governance triangle that you see there on the screen, Gurrow describes platform governance as a form of media governance characterized by self-regulation, informal mechanisms, and multi-stakeholder initiatives as a way to shape the behavior of firms. And essentially, this is visualized through the platform governance triangle, in which we see various types of actors involved in governing online spaces. And so that's indicated by states or governments, firms or technology companies, and NGOs. And the way that these work together, shaped by various agendas and power dynamics in order to regulate online spaces. The important point to emphasize here, though, is that platforms govern. They shape content rules, and governments and civil society apply pressure on platforms to affect their governance approaches. So bearing this in mind, thinking about ways of countering the far right online are initially a number of hard approaches. So these are the ones that we're perhaps most familiar with, things like deplatforming or suspension, which is a short period of time in which an account is deplatformed. And just to say that the far right is very well aware of these types of hard approaches, and it's been sort of a recurrent reactionary topic amongst mainstream platforms in terms of the steps that tech companies have taken to address this content. There's also things like demonetization, which is it's a strategy often used on YouTube to indicate sort of prohibiting sponsorship or advertising revenue towards accounts. But sometimes this can happen in a variety of different platforms, not just the usual suspects like YouTube, but ones like Coinbase, which is a digital currency portfolio where you can buy and trade cryptocurrency, for instance. So that post there is taken from an influencer's Instagram account in which she has been essentially banned from Coinbase's platform. And then there's also other things like content moderation, which is narrowing down a specific piece of content, say a tweet or a post, as opposed to punishments upon an account more broadly. And I gave an example there from Instagram to actually indicate the ways that far-right actors are circumventing content moderation on posts. So there's an Instagram post on the bottom right, spreading disinformation about the coronavirus vaccine in terms of affecting female and male fertility, and quote, "This is all a plan to reduce the population via widespread sterilization," so spreading disinformation about the vaccine. But you will also notice in the post that she deliberately misspells, manipulates the wording of vaccination. And this is because during the pandemic, Instagram would have a pop-up for users directing them to World Health Organization's official website on the coronavirus vaccine, in case any wording of vaccination or vaccine appeared on Instagram content. But this deliberate manipulation of the wording is a way of circumventing that type of content moderation. And then there are also other hard approaches pertaining more to platforms like Google or YouTube about manipulated search results or actually changing algorithm structures. But it's important to take away that different platforms have different purposes. So mainstream platforms primarily are operated on exposure and amplification of content, as opposed to fringe platforms where users are already radicalized, and it's a way of fostering that collective identity through communications and mobilization. And then similarly, there are a number of soft approaches that can be applied. One of the most common ones that's popped up in recent years are so-called counter-narratives. That is, narratives designed to promote alternative ideas to say far-right content. One of the most well-known players within this field is Moonshot, which is a company that looks at online harms, and they have piloted what's called the redirect method, which is actually building upon Google's advertising revenue, in which if a user encounters extremist content, they are then can click a link and then it redirects them to de-radicalization initiatives or to seek assistance and help in viewing that content. And I will say that the effectiveness of counter narratives is a bit disputed, in part because there's simply not a lot of information about the effectiveness. But if you're interested, there's an excellent report by Voxpol called Extreme Digital Speech, which assesses the effectiveness of counter narratives within the CVE industry. And then finally, and I know I'm short on time, I wanted to address also an overlooked aspect, which is influencer culture itself as something that's not seriously addressed within these spaces, and particularly the gendered ways in which they manifest. As Benjamin Lee has written, looking at what he calls informal counter messengers within the UK's CVE industry, and in particular looking at the UK's counter-extremism strategy, Lee has found that it's important to assess the motivation or the ideology of these counter messengers, what are the various strategies that they employ, but also the risk that it poses to their involvement in, say, government-sponsored CVE programming. And what Lee emphasizes is that if you do employ influencers or counter messengers, it's important to provide them credibility and autonomy or control over the creative process. And this is actually a result of what was a backfire in terms of the government's, the UK government's approach towards trying to employ informal counter messengers and addressing sort of anti-ISIS content. So just to conclude, we see that mainstream platforms like YouTube and Instagram are ideal for visuality and opportunities for influencers to reach a wide audience, in particular, given their amplification and exposure on these platforms. Secondly, is that far-right women legitimize and normalize the movement by presenting it through subtle framing and through content that is assumed to be non-political. And I wish I had more time today to discuss some more of that content. But in short, this effect should be taken seriously in assessing the drivers of radicalization, recruitment, and propaganda into the far right. And penultimately, the impact of far-right women in producing dominant narratives is crucial towards developing effective P/CVE interventions, which often overlook the importance of gender dynamics in shaping an individual's worldview, whether that's a man or a woman. And that finally, countering the far-right means working, or really countering extremism, means working within this broader platform governance framework of states, tech companies and NGOs, and addressing multi-stakeholder agendas, which sometimes can be competing and sometimes not, but it's definitely a territory to navigate for the future. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Eviane, for highlighting this gendered perspective to this debate. I think it's really important for us to remember, and also I think often what tends to dominate research in this field is the political alignment of individuals and who are committing acts of online extremism, but perhaps the gendered element to them is overlooked, and your research is really important to bring this to light. Something that I wanted to also explore perhaps in this section is this new and emerging trend in incel culture, which I know that you've written about, but I'm just going to end the discussion here. Liam has to shoot off quickly. Sorry. No worries. But thank you so much, Liam, for your contributions to this discussion. It's really important that we have a multidisciplinary approach when looking at these issues, and we hear from academics and non-academic experts and anyone else who's working in the field at community or national or international level. So thank you so much for that. and we'll be in touch on email.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks.
Okay, so to Carmen and to Eviane, we have some questions from our YouTube viewers. So someone has said, how realistic is it to expect a higher level of global cooperation when tackling these issues of regulating online platforms?
Should I start on this? Yeah, so I mean, part of my work has been involved working with ICCT, which is the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, which emerged as an initiative from 4 of the big tech companies. So that was Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. And now it's extended to, I think, almost 24 companies, big and small, ranging to different purposes, but all committed towards exploring the types of policy measures that could be created and shared and exchanged across these different tech companies. And it's important to recognize that some tech companies simply lack the resources available in-house to be able to also deal with this type of problematic content, not to mention, as I referenced earlier in my presentation, that different platforms have different purposes. But ICCT is certainly a step, and it does sort of extend towards its academic arm as well, which is called GNet, the Global Network on Extremism and Technologies. So that's how academic research, which, sometimes academic research does have difficulty actually accessing these types of online spaces, but it's a way of facilitating that dialogue between academics and researchers more broadly with policy teams in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, there is certainly some competing agendas and perhaps biases at stake in terms of, everyone does want to see perhaps content being regulated, but there's political concerns. There's also legal concerns with regulating that content based upon national, regional, international frameworks. And so it's messy, it's complicated. But I will say that on the last point here, before Carmen jumps in, that a lot of the tools that have been developed to regulate content in recent years emerged in response to regulating ISIS content or jihadist content, which was actually quite systematic in its application. Now, with the far right, it's been rather more ad hoc. It hasn't been as systematic, and that is partly due to differing opinions about what constitutes problematic content, as well as various political concerns as well. So I'll leave it there, but maybe Carmen would like to jump in as well.
Thank you, Eviane. And before I say anything, so my apologies for my presentation, because it was not shown in the slideshow, so you cannot see properly in a nice way, and it was a little bit distracting, so apologies for my PowerPoint. I wanted to say also something very interesting what Eviane said, and I always think that it's true that we need, let's say, a macro approach to the problem from the big companies and techs, also not treating the all type of radicalization in the same way. As she pointed out, it's not the same Islamic or Islamist terrorism and the far right and other types of radicalization. Now we have also this misogyny online and this kind of different problems, sometimes overlap, sometimes are part of the problem. So we need to get to know the problem really to see how to tackle it. And one of the key points, I think, is, as Eviane just pointed out, that not all platforms are the same, not all problems are the same. And once we get to know that, there would be, we will be easier to find a solution, if easier. But also I think that the problem could be tackled from a micro perspective. So that is the macro and the big companies and the big powers dynamics here downplay here. But also, what about education? And also, what about educating critical thinkers from I think one of the problems is that government expect that, or they just wait till citizens are teenagers. Sometimes when we see the ages in which people are recruited and radicalized is too late. We need to, from the very beginning, digital literacy, and but not only for students, but also for teachers, educators. And this is one of the missing points. I was like, they don't know how to tackle the problem, because nobody taught them how to do. what to do. So even if they have the good intention that they're willing to do something, they don't know how to tackle this problem. So I think it's, again, there is a multi-layer solution for a big problematic situation, which is radicalization online. So I think all the efforts should be combined. And also we need government being aware of the real problem that radicalization is to and be able to take measures on these from different perspectives.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's a really nice way to end, to acknowledge that this issue of online extremism is not a single entity issue. It's not a one solution issue. It's actually very multi-layered. It requires multiple actors. It requires tech companies, governments, teachers, parents, individuals to be accountable for their actions and to also be aware of the information that they're consuming online, who they're interacting with online, and to be very mindful about the ways in which the internet can influence our thinking and also our activity in very subtle ways, actually, as well. So that's definitely the multi-layered dimension to this huge issue that you've both touched upon, is a great way for us to end here. I'm sorry we're out of time. I think we're running over by 10 minutes. Now, as ever, the dialogue doesn't end here. So if you are watching this and you have any further questions, then please do reach out to us at the Dialogue Society on our socials, or you may also contact our experts via their emails, and I'm sure that we'd all be very happy to answer you. I'd like to thank Carmen, Chris and Eviane today for kindly offering your expertise and knowledge sharing with us today. Much of what has been discussed pertains to very real-time and new trends that are emerging globally in this online extremism sphere. And this nicely interlinks with our final panel discussion, which is also looking at these new trends. So I will see you next time for our panel on extremism behind bars or in prisons. And have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye.